I recently watched the Glee documentary, and it was bad, so I have some thoughts. Hello, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about The Rise of Glee, which is the Glee documentary that came out recently. Now, Glee is a comfort show for me and my friends, so when we saw that this documentary was coming out, we obviously were going to watch it. So my friends and I got together, we put on the Glee documentary, we sat down, we watched all 3 episodes in one sitting, and afterwards, I was left dumbfounded. Not only did I not learn anything new from the documentary, but it felt disrespectful to the people who were on Glee. So we'll start with some background information. This documentary was made by Investigation Discovery, which is a TV channel that mainly focuses on true crime documentaries. Now, although this documentary was about Glee, none of the Glee cast was involved in the making of this documentary, and in fact, the actors for Artie, Tina, Sam, and Kitty all spoke out against the making of this documentary and said they didn't want to be involved because they felt that the set of Glee was a family and they didn't want to betray them or spill their secrets. So if the cast of Glee wasn't involved in this in any way, you may be asking, like, who are they interviewing in this documentary? So in the interviews for the documentary, they interview several people, and these include Corey Monteith's ex-roommate, Corey Monteith's friend, Corey Monteith's publicist, Naya Rivera's father, the art director of Glee, a rigging gaffer on Glee, a set director on Glee, and a psychotherapist, a celebrity researcher, and 4 entertainment reporters. So the documentary is split up into 3 episodes, so we're going to start with the first episode that is mainly about the rise of Glee and kind of an introduction to Corey Monteith and his struggles. The whole documentary starts with a black screen and a quote coming up in white letters, and it's a quote by Ryan Murphy, who is the creator of Glee, and it says, "What started off as being such a great celebration of love and acceptance ultimately became about darkness and death." And Ryan Murphy, it's not that serious. Take a deep breath. We just started. So next they do kind of like your typical intro where they show like little clips from the most exciting parts of the rest of the documentary. So they're throwing out things about suicide and drug addiction and domestic abuse. And in the background, they have Lea Michele singing "Don't Stop Believing."
Circulating that alcohol and some substances were found in his hotel room.
Glee actor Mark Salling has been arrested on suspicion of possessing child pornography.
And it just does not fit the tone at all. One of the first topics that they cover is the casting of Glee, and they talk a lot about how they cast the actors as themselves. Like, they created these characters based on who they cast, basically. So one thing I actually really liked in the documentary is they showed Lea Michele's audition tape for the role of Rachel Berry, and it is insane. Like, there is no way she acts like that in real life. I've never seen a human being act in that way.
Hello, Ray. We have to go back to the second verse. It's supposed to be funny. That was my serious part. I'm going to do it again, and I want you all to cry.
We also find out in this part that Mark Salling, the guy who plays Puck, lied about his age when auditioning and told them he was 19 when he was 26. And I feel like they move on from that one a little too quickly. So next they talk about like the fan base of Glee and how it gained its fans. They talk about how social media was a huge influence in the rise of the Glee fandom and Gleeks. They talk about how Glee went on a mall tour to different hot topics to meet fans, and what I would give to have experienced that. Are you kidding me? And then they go into some of the downsides of it becoming so famous. They talk about stalking, they talk about paparazzi, and they mention Chris Colfer, who plays Kurt, being assaulted, basically. A random fan walked up to him and just kissed him, and then they move on. I feel like they definitely could have spent more time talking about like the fame aspect and how these people came from like relative obscurity. Like Lea Michele was on Broadway beforehand, but most of the others weren't like famous, and they just got shot to stardom. And I think it would have been really interesting if the documentary spent more time talking about that aspect. But they couldn't spend time talking about that because they immediately moved into Corey Monteith. Corey Monteith played the main male lead in the cast of Finn, and we get introduced to the fact that Corey had some troubles in his teenage years with drugs and alcohol. But the way they address that is very weird. They show like this extremely like misleading fact on the screen that's like Corey Monteith's parents got divorced when he was 7 and by 11 he was taking drugs. And it's like, I think we left out some important things, and you can't just put those things next to each other and imply that that's the whole story. The watcher is soon distracted from this though when Gustavo from Big Time Rush comes on screen. Now, why is Gustavo from Big Time Rush being interviewed? Let me tell you, it's because he was Corey Monteith's pal, his best friend. And by this I mean that in what the documentary has shown, we are seeing like 2 videos of them together, and it looks like it might be from the same party or event. We see that they sent each other some emails at one point, and Gustavo tells us that they had lunch once. Now, I'm not saying that they weren't friends because I don't know. What I'm saying is the documentary did not provide enough background for me to believe that these 2 were friends. And that's a big problem I have with this documentary. They don't build the credibility of the people they're interviewing at all. So it's hard for me to like take what these interviewees are saying as fact because I don't have enough information to know if they would be a good source of fact. First episode then ends by telling us that Corey went public with his past issues with drugs and alcohol, and that he started showing up to set late and unprepared, and then he disappeared to Canada and he was found dead in a hotel room. And the first episode leaves on a cliffhanger that's kind of like, how did Corey die? How did this man who had so many issues with drugs and alcohol and also was in a pressure cooker of fame and stardom and the Glee set and all the other issues that come with that, how could he have died? We don't know. And they do this repeatedly. They make things seem like we need to solve a case when it's a very clear-cut line of reasoning that the viewer can follow, and it just makes the viewer feel like stupid. So the second episode of the documentary is pretty much entirely dedicated to Corey Monteith's death. So they start with building up the story leading up to Corey Monteith's death. They tell us that he was in less episodes of season 4 of Glee, and that is because he was going to rehab at the time. And there's this one interviewee who's talking about like why he was so stressed and why he was under all this pressure, and he's like, he was stressed about dancing, and like maybe that contributed to it, but I don't think it was the main reason. The interviewees then give their reaction to the news of his death, and only like 2 of them were called directly about his death, and the rest of them read it in the news. Then the documentary builds up this cause of death. They're like, what could have caused this? What could have made him die in this hotel room? And it goes on for a while until they finally reveal that there was heroin, alcohol, and depressants in his bloodstream at his time of death. So the documentary finally comes to the conclusion that he overdosed, which is a conclusion that I would say 95% of viewers had reached about 15 minutes ago. Then the documentary kind of shifts and goes into what could have caused this relapse. And they tell an interesting story. This is one of the like stories I actually did like from this documentary. I like that they included this, of a hairdresser for Corey who said that Corey had told him that one of his castmates had kind of like subtly encouraged him to drink even though he was sober, saying something like, oh, you should have a drink if you want one. And the hairdresser doesn't name who this castmate is. I've seen people speculate that it's Lea Michele, but I don't want to make those kind of accusations. And after this story, the show kind of puts blame on Lea Michele for Corey's death, and I don't know how I feel about that because it does feel kind of insensitive. Like, I don't like Lea Michele generally, but the thought of her losing someone that close to her and having people like pin it on her, that seems kind of fucked up in my opinion. I don't know. Let me know what you guys think. I'm still on the fence on that one. The documentary then takes a little interlude to just talk about Lea Michele and all the fucked up things she did, and they have someone who was like a background character on the cast in one of the episodes tell a story about the episode he was in. After they were done filming, Darren Criss invited him to sit with them at lunch because he was like, oh, all the cast are going to get lunch together if you want to come. So this background actor goes to lunch with them and he's sitting down, and he said he got pulled out of the room by some like production assistant. And she said, someone at the table doesn't want you sitting there. And although the production assistant didn't name drop Leah Michelle, the background actor was like, is it Leah? And the production assistant was like, and that is such middle school behavior from Leah. You don't have to talk to this person or interact with them or spend one-on-one time with them. They were just eating in the same vicinity as you, and you were so upset that they were like not a star on the show, so they had to leave because they were like below your level. So that story was interesting. I did like that they included that because it just speaks so much to her character. Then one of the crew members of the set is talking about the on-set culture and mostly about like Naya and Leah's like feud or whatever on set, and he says, I hesitate to use the word bitchy, but... And he should have hesitated a little bit more because that was uncalled for. Feels misogynistic. I don't know. I don't like a man calling two women bitchy. Sue me. So Leah's behavior and Corey's death are kind of linked together at the end of the episode when we talk about returning to set after Corey's death. So apparently Ryan Murphy approached Leah Michelle and was like, what do you want to do with this? Do you want to stop filming altogether? Do you want to wait a few months? Or do you want to go back? And Leah Michelle was like, let's go back to set. And shouldn't the other people who were also very close to Corey and probably going through their own grieving processes been involved in this decision? Because they then go on to explain kind of the on-set vibe when recording The Quarterback, which is the episode about Finn's death because of Corey's death. And it sounds like emotional torture. And like those cast members were really going through it. And it feels like they probably should have given them a little bit more than 2 weeks to process this. So that's kind of the end of them talking about Corey and his death. And then they briefly at the end mention that there were 2 crew members who had killed themselves. 2 who had had heart attacks, one at the age of 41 and one who had died in a car fire, which are all terrible tragedies, but it feels like they're just mentioning these to kind of propel this idea of there being like a Glee curse, because they don't go into detail about any of these human lives that were lost or any of the stressors that they encountered that could have led to this, or really any like just any details about them, any compassion shown. It's just like, oh yeah, all these people died. Isn't that weird? Isn't that spooky? And don't even get me started on the way that this documentary flip-flops back and forth about if there's a Glee curse or not, because they're always like, oh, I don't want to say it. I don't want to say there was a curse, but you know, like, there's probably a curse. And it's like, just stop. Alright, so I actually already recorded episode 3 and my final thoughts, but my phone died and I lost the footage and I'm trying not to cry. So this is from here on out going to be me retelling what I already said, so I'm sorry if I seem weird. So episode 3 deals with Mark Salling's death, Naya Rivera's death, and also the domestic abuse situation between Blake and Melissa. So we start off with Mark Salling, who played Puck in the show. We've discussed previously how the characters were kind of based off of the cast when they auditioned, but this continued throughout the show, where on-set conversations or things about the cast members were used in the show for the characters. So for Puck, we go through some of these. Puck's character was always very sexual. At one point, he was dating a woman who was old enough to be his mom when he was still underage, I believe. At another point, it is implied that he is going to hook up with an underage girl when he is of age. And there is also an episode where there is a joke about him creating child porn.
Now for the downside. Are you aware that because you're under 18 years of age, making and owning a sex tape could make you guilty of child pornography?
This is because he and Lauren were going to make a sex tape, and Gwyneth Paltrow's character comes in and is like, that would be child pornography because you are underage.
I overheard you talking to that sophomore girl yesterday.
Whoa, back off, dude. You got a fiance. Plus, I called dibs on all the chicks whose boobs aren't done growing yet.
Not that, okay?
Now, all of these things were weird in the show as they were, but it gets weirder when you either remember or learn that after the show, Mark Salling was arrested for child pornography. So after Mark was arrested, he pled guilty and he was sentenced to 4 to 7 years in prison. The documentary then explains that a little while later, his body was found dead in the woods. He had killed himself. And they mentioned that it was found a couple miles into the forest. And me and my friends had a discussion about that afterwards, about how terrifying and harrowing the idea of going on a hike alone. You're already thinking a lot, you're already overthinking and introspecting. But the idea of doing that, knowing that when you get to your destination, you are going to kill yourself, is terrifying. And also those poor first responders who had to walk several miles into the woods, find the body, and then bring it back several miles out of the woods. That sounds awful. So generally, I do not mind the way that this documentary talks about Mark Salling or everything that happened to him, but what I do dislike is at the end when one of the interviewees is theorizing about what could have possibly driven him to kill himself. They're like, is it because the show was over and because he didn't have the show anymore? Was it because he had lost some of his friends previously? Or was it because he was arrested and indicted for child pornography? And I don't know, it just seems like maybe that last one was the majority of the reason. The show then takes a weird shift where they start talking about like cast relationships, but then they specifically get into Blake and Melissa, who played Ryder and Marley on the show, and they were in a relationship. They got married and eventually they got divorced, and later Melissa posted a video on her social media detailing her experience as a domestic abuse survivor. And although she did not name Blake by name in the video, it's widely accepted that that is who she was talking about because it was her kind of only long-term relationship. And it's good that they addressed this in the documentary, but what I did not like was that one interviewee afterwards said that Melissa will forever be labeled as that. And as what? As a survivor? As a victim? It was kind of a fucked up thing to say, and it was weird that they kept it in the documentary, and it just made me feel weird. Then they shift into Naya Rivera's death. But before they get to that, they start with her relationship post-Glee, and they talk about how her partner pressed charges against her for domestic violence. These charges were dropped, but they play her court tape of her appearing in court, and it feels like that is a little too far. It's a little personal. It feels unnecessary. It feels like that didn't need to be included and aired out. When they do start talking about her death, however, Naya's father is actually one of the people being interviewed, which I think is one of the people that I do really understand why they had him involved in this documentary. And they have him go back out to the lake where Naya had died for the first time since she had died, and it seems like that's a little bit too personal and emotional of a situation to film and for me to be watching. And as soon as they bring up that Naya drowned, people start speculating about how she could have drowned. They float the idea of it being murder, of someone pushing her in, of her jumping in, or of her being so drunk that she just like fell in and couldn't swim. And it feels disrespectful to just throw out all these wild theories when it's pretty clear and established what happened to her and that she just drowned. But they continue this theorizing by showing a clip of Naya's dad saying that she was a good swimmer, and also him saying that he never was given an excuse why she had died. But in my mind, it's entirely plausible that someone who normally could swim would have some kind of freak accident and drown, even if there were no other contributing factors going in. But this is not the angle that the documentary takes, of course. They have a reporter go out on a boat onto the lake with this guy, and the guy explains to her all the ways someone could drown. So the guy starts by reading off Naya's tox report and that it is clean. Then the reporter floats the idea that she was poisoned by carbon monoxide from the boat engine, and they spend a good while debunking this, even though it's just not a plausible theory and would have showed up in the tox reports. The guy on the boat does give some valid information, telling us that there were like 20-mile-an-hour gusts of wind, that this lake specifically has wind coming from different directions, so the waves could have been confusing, and that it's likely that panic set in for her, or exhaustion even. And then they wait until the last second to tell us that Naya had extreme vertigo and often got physically ill from how bad it was, which might have had something to do with the fact that she drowned. I just don't like how long they spend like speculating and disproving theories that have no credibility. Then after they're done speculating how she died, they move on to questioning why she was out on a lake with her son in the first place. They act like that's a strange thing to do, like it's not normal for a mom to take her son out for a day on the lake. After all this, they wrap up this final episode and the whole series by once again bringing up the Glee curse and having a weird vocal effect / echo thing on Corey Monteith's voice.
That's awesome. It's great. It's as fun as it looks. It's as fun as it looks.
And it's just weird and creepy. So now that we've talked about what was included in the documentary, I want to talk about some of the things that I think that they left out that I think would have been good additions to this documentary. The first of these things is the Glee Project, which was when they had a bunch of people kind of compete to win a spot on Glee, and it's how they got a lot of the cast members in the later seasons. And it's an insane thing that happened, and it was like a big part of the series, and it's not mentioned once, and I just think that that could have been a cool thing for them to explore. And if you want to watch a video on that, there's one that Jordan Teresa did, and I'll link it down below. I suggest watching it because it was really good. Another big thing they didn't mention is the Glee concert tour. They brought it up like once, but I think it would have been interesting to hear more about that and how that went and how that could have added pressure to the cast members. Speaking of pressure, they didn't talk enough, in my opinion, about the on-set culture and overworking. They briefly stated at one point that the cast had a 70-hour work week, which is insane, and it would have been cool to see like a breakdown of their week and how it compares to a regular TV show and why that added so much more pressure and stress onto these stars. In a similar vein, they also didn't talk a lot about the like overworking or abuse of the crew members. They do mention that the crew members had 72 to 100-hour work weeks, and of course they mentioned the 6 that died, but they only briefly bring it up to kind of push the idea of there being some kind of Glee curse. They don't go into any details. They don't talk about what the conditions were for these crew members on set that could have led to this happening. And they had crew members being interviewed that they could have asked questions about their own like personal experience on set and just their experience, and it would have been interesting and it would have added a new layer to the documentary. And finally, there's 2 people that I feel like they didn't focus enough on at all. And the first is Leah Michelle. They briefly mentioned that she was like difficult, and they talk about her relationship with Corey a bit, but they don't ever get into the accusations of her racism at all and how she had treated her fellow castmates. Even when they bring up that like lunch table story where she kicked out a background actor, they don't bring up the fact that she singled out the black male background actor to kick out. They just don't bring up any discussions of her racism or mistreatment of her cast members. And the last person that I think they really should have had more on was Ryan Murphy, the creator of Glee. They briefly mentioned that he's demanding, and they tell a story about how he had a whole nother set built, but it feels like he should be a bigger just presence in this documentary. He is the reason Glee exists. He was the driving factor in a majority of this. This documentary really should have addressed the accusations of like emotional abuse and overworking that he put on cast and crew, and also how his method of creating the characters around the actors and including actors' real life personal experiences in the characters' journeys kind of screwed with the actors' like minds. Like he would take an actor's like personal insecurity and have another character make fun of their character for it. And that seems like it was a huge thing that could have led to the toxic workplace and the effects that we've seen of that toxic workplace afterwards. It's just strange that he isn't brought up more and he isn't linked to these things more. Some other overall thoughts: the documentary just felt too speculative to me. They used a lot of language like, oh, this maybe caused this probably led to this, or this might have done this. And I get that they sometimes need to include that language in order to avoid being sued for what they were saying, but it feels like if a big like part of your documentary, like a big point that you really tried to get across, if the whole thing is speculative, maybe it's not the thing that you should be focusing on in this documentary, when there's other more concrete things that you could be focusing on that would be more interesting. Generally, another big issue for me was that the people that they chose to interview lacked the kind of credibility and relevance that I'm really looking for in a documentary. And it's not even necessarily that these people aren't credible. They could be. I don't know much about them, and that's the problem. The film didn't spend any time establishing the credibility or relevance of the people being interviewed. For example, they had like a psychotherapist on there, and they had entertainment reporters, and all they did to establish who those people were was put under their name like a little title that said like entertainment reporter. But anyone could claim to be an entertainment reporter. Technically, like making this video, I could be an entertainment reporter. That doesn't mean that I have the credibility or relevance to be speaking on Glee and its effects on these people's lives. So personally, I would not recommend watching this documentary. Maybe you would have learned something if you had never seen Glee before and didn't know about these deaths, but as someone who has watched Glee, I didn't learn anything new, really, from watching this documentary. Let me know if you have watched this documentary, if you also did not like it, or if you liked it. If you did, let me know why. Like, it's fine if you did, just personally, I did not enjoy this documentary. Also, I know this is kind of a different video for me. It is on a documentary instead of a film, and it was a little bit more negative, but let me know what you thought of it, and also let me know what you think of. I was thinking of doing some Glee episode reviews on some of the bigger, more pivotal episodes of Glee, because I'm a Gleek at heart. So let me know what you think about that idea. And as always, I would appreciate it so much if you would subscribe to the channel, leave a like down below, and thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you liked it, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.